Right. So, welcome to another installment of Leo's Logic, and today I'm going to be going over the diverse array of skills that players can develop while competing in esports, whether it be on a multitude of levels at the most professional or just on an entry level, and how these skills could be transferable to alternate career paths, whether it be in the future or just to life in general, right? But I'll also go over, I had the idea to add on at the end of this potential career shifts within esports should players, when they feel that their time is done actually participating as a player competitively, want to move on but stay in the ecosystem of esports. So we're going to highlight a few examples of what you could do and people who have done it in the past. Because, right, esports is not as brand new as it was, even though that there are definitely some mainstream sources that don't educate themselves on the matter as much. So to my experiences, I'll be highlighting a few of the traits that I think are exceptionally important and also how I've seen players develop them and what aspects of certain games can actually assist you in developing them. So the first thing that I want to highlight for sure is going to be interpersonal and team building experience. And I think that's a no-brainer. A lot of the more popular esports, whether you go to CSGO, Overwatch, less popular Paladins, more popular League of Legends, it's a team environment, right? And a lot of the times, even if you're in the amateur scene, there is a structure where there's some sort of leader. You have your peers with you, which is a team of like five, maybe more. A little less familiar with CSGO, admittedly, so I don't know the number of people on those teams, but largely you think about five players, maybe more. With some exceptions. So no matter what, you're usually working in a dynamic environment where even if you have a few people on a team, you also have a coach that's above you, maybe even an owner or somebody that's a part of an organization, whether it be, just one sprouting out of the ground, or if it's somebody that's more established. For instance, like Paladins, we have things like Elevate, Onslaught, who tend to be a little bit more established. Um, and that puts you in a position where, over the course of a league, if you enter one, or tournaments, or as you are a roster scrimmaging, practicing, doing things like VOD reviews, right? You're starting to build this team cohesion. You understand how to navigate a multitude of personalities that are always with you. And most importantly, on an entry level, usually you're doing this remotely, right? So normally you have like the escape button if you really feel like things are, you kind of just dodge. But the important thing is that the people who don't, the people who stick it out and actually try to navigate these unique personalities, some of which can be quite contentious depending on the individuals and depending on the roles or the topic of conversation, because this is competition, right? Everybody's going to feel quite strongly about their opinions of the game, and it might clash. And I think that's why I always advocate personally for coaching when it comes to teams, whether it be the most amateur level or entry level of an esport to the highest level. Obviously, the highest levels usually have coaches, but just as an example or just to emphasize. So as time goes on and you do manage to have these discourses and open up these potential arguments or debates, that's when you really come face to face with who you might be as a person, and then how you choose to handle people who might frustrate you, who might get on your nerves, or people who might not just see things the same way that you do. Any other incongruities in personality types, whether it be passive aggression, outright I don't know, degradation, things like this. It really challenges you as a person and makes you become a more dynamic social person. You're able to enter these situations with much more tact and much more attention for the nuances that occur within them. You understand exactly how to execute on disarming friction and tension and making sure that the atmosphere and the environment stays together, stays focused. And you might not be team leader yourself, but to also be in the presence of other people who might have that skill a little more advanced than you do, it also puts you in a nice position where you actually get to observe and witness people execute on that, right? You get to kind of internalize it and emulate it should you wish to. And interpersonal skill obviously comes into that. Again, just navigating people. So that's why I put them together, because obviously team building exercises, becoming closer, more like comrades, not even necessarily friends. Obviously, friendship counts. Work relationships are important as well. But I think one of the really important skills is actually communication. And to just emphasize how important that is, no matter what job you're going into, you're going to be a part of some sort of coherent work structure. You're going to have subordinates, you're going to have superiors, you're going to have people that you have to answer to, people that you have to delegate tasks to, right? No matter what part of the any organization or career, any company that you enter to. And communication is really important. To do so concisely is really good. To be able to know what information you extract from a situation and relay to your superior to make sure they're on the same page as you, making sure that you can relay it to your subordinates so that when you do delegate tasks, you know exactly who's doing what. You're going to understand exactly what you convey to them exactly exactly what they have to do to make sure that they do it well accurately, right? It puts you in an interesting position, whether you're a leader or a subordinate to somebody else, where you can be on the same page decisively and come to the table and bring forth information clearly and confidently, be on the same page. And I think that the way that esports hones this in particular is in the team environment. When you are participating in games specifically, you're relaying a lot of different information, right? And I'll get into critical thinking a little bit later, but you're parsing so much information at once. You're thinking, who's on the map? Where are they? What can they do? Who used what ability? Or where can I push and do so safely? Am I a champion with mobility? Can I get away with being a little further forward? Do I have to sit in the back line as a DPS because I don't have any mobility in my kit inherently? And a lot of these things that might be abstract to other people, but you can cite them as a source where, we had to account for all these factors and relay them concisely in the game. Therefore, we know how to wean the appropriate details, the most important facts, and just get them over to our teammates so we can be on the same page, go ahead with the same course of action, and just kind of be this monolithic unit, as close to it as you could possibly get, right? So not only in game, but after game, when you're doing things like VOD reviews and other activities, you get to actually deconstruct and break down even smaller niche portions of that gameplay. You get to say, well, I made this decision because at this point in time, I only saw X, Y, and Z, right? I can't see behind me. I didn't really see anything to the other side. And maybe my teammate didn't communicate this, that. So I went under this assumption. And, no shade at the teammate, right? But it's a point that you would address, obviously, if you're trying to make your team stronger. You relay what you know at that time, and then you improve from there. But that communication, that detailed exposure of some fault or failure, that allows the team to come back stronger. That allows your direct analysis, your direct input through your discourse to be able to identify an issue and then potentially resolve it, right? Whatever hands it has to go into, whether it be a coach in esports or if you were a part of a company, I guess the manager, or supervisor, whoever the hell would be directly above you. Beyond communication, though, I think that multitasking and prioritization, which links back to the example I was giving in-game, is important here, right? Because again, we're parsing a lot of different information, regardless what game that you're playing. And the two games that I participated in the most, League of Legends and Paladins, I'll break down exactly how it functions there, right? So in League of Legends, you're in the game, and let's say you're a mid laner, you're up against your other mid laner, you have to account for the jungler, you have to account for the position of the top laner. If he's going to roam, does the bottom lane have priority? Could they potentially roam? Can their support roam? How many things must you think about? How is the wave pushing? If I CS at this rate, can I freeze it in the middle of the lane? Can I freeze it closer to my tower? There are so many variables that a player has to account for at some of the highest levels, whether it be solo queue or actual scrimmages or even on the LCS stage for that matter. And to get to a place where your brain can automatically filter that's a level of multitasking and prioritizing exactly what you should be doing, because if you realize and recognize the potential threats that can come your way, now you have to think, well, I know that I want the CS, I need the gold, it'll get me this item, but if I step this far forward, since the wave is frozen towards the enemy's tower, I expose myself to a gank. But wait a minute, I have wards on the right side of my lane, I could kind of play to the side. My jungler's also on the right side of the jungle, so if something happens, I can call him over, he can rotate quickly, right? So you start to prioritize what your actions are. Do I go for this 1v1 outplay, not having any idea where the enemy jungler or top laner are? Probably not, unless you have some concrete evidence that they're either in the base or potentially as far away from you as possible so that they can't get there in time. Does the enemy champion have low mobility or low counterplay options? Maybe that increases the odds that you take that. But you weigh these factors in, and that's how you prioritize the actions that you do take. Maybe if you're a wave clear champion as opposed to an assassin, you decide, you know what? I'm not going for a 1v1 outplay. I'm just going to control this wave. I'm just going to farm up CS, build a bunch of items, and nuke things at the 30-minute mark or 25-minute mark, right? So those are a lot of things that people take into account. Now, Paladins, the games last a little bit shorter, right? You're accounting for the same number of variables, though. You're looking at what itemization do they have. We have a Ceres healer. Can I push? It's an early round. They don't have a lot of cauterize. Maybe I can get away with trying to pressure them out. Maybe I won't die because the amount of healing that I'll receive is just outweighed. It can't be mitigated by caught one. Tanks who just use their shield. Obviously, I don't have my shield. They have some form of CC. Maybe I don't want to push up. I'll just keep peeking from behind this wall. I'm Ashe. I'll keep peeking from behind this wall and shooting an auto attack every now and again. Wait for my shield to come back up and manage that, right? So this ability to multitask, to see exactly the courses of action that you want to do and prioritize that based off of the evidence that you're witnessing, that's a really big skill. You're essentially, and we'll get into the critical thinking next because it links directly into this, you're parsing so much information quicker than any onlooker or spectator probably could. Now, granted, experienced spectators who participate in esports can look at the game and they can say, yeah, I see all the things that you're seeing, but I don't have the pressure of being in the game. Therefore, I might be able to evaluate it a little more completely without my mentality being under the stress or duress of the moment, right? But for spectators, people who are not regular participants in the game, or maybe low elo, they don't interpret the information the same way, they're definitely not going to come to that same level of understanding, not as quickly. Maybe if they look over the VOD, they're able to pause something and acknowledge these different circumstances, sure. But as a professional player, you're doing this at such a high level. And I think that demonstrates the ability to multitask and micromanage different activities within the game based off of these intangibles and variables, right? But critical thinking and adaptation links directly into this, right? If we go back to the example of leagues, what action am I taking? You're parsing all those variables, those intangibles. You're multitasking, watching different people in different lanes. You're observing the flow of the minion wave, who has priority on your team or their team in the separate lanes, and what you can do with that, right? And what else is on the map, maybe like neutral objectives, et cetera, all these factors. And you weigh them all in, and you think to yourself, well, what can I do here? And then this is where adaptation comes in, right? An attention to detail. Because you're going to notice, hey, I can do X, Y, and Z right now. But then all of a sudden, there's a miscalculation sometimes, right? You're not going to get everything 100% correct in every game that you play, because different players play the same champions different ways, right? So there might be somebody who plays something a little lax. Maybe there's a Zed player who just waits for that level 6 to all in. Maybe there's a hyper-aggressive Zed player who likes to just go in and make a big trade with Ignite at like level 3 when you least expect it. You never know. It's all dependent on the player. And now when you come across these circumstances where somebody plays something, I would say off center, so like off style, just not expected, then that's where adaptation comes in. You have to be a quick thinker, critical thinking yet again, because you have to learn how to adapt to that moment and say, well, what's my best course of action now? And to keep in mind, you're in the middle of an engage. This is going to last maybe about 5 seconds, maybe 10 seconds, depending on how early the game is and what the damage is like. So you have the span of a few seconds to figure out, hey, what have they used? What have I used? What do they have? What do I have? And has anything changed in the last few seconds? Could the enemy jungler come here? Is the top laner have teleport? Can they potentially teleport into the lane and do something about this situation? Has the enemy bot lane, the support champion, been missing for a certain amount of time? And these are variables you account for, and you have to adapt to that. It's like, well, I went for this play, I didn't kill him, so now I have to back off, because there's too much of a threat that other people can influence the circumstance. Similarly, if you want to take an example into Paladins, right? You can think to yourself, if you are a champion that is a flank, I guess you would say, the most comparable thing to an assassin from, say, League of Legends. Let's say you're Xin. I mean, he's got some Billow nerfs, so bad example. But either way, so let's say you're Xin. You dive into the back line, you have Whirl, you have Billow, you can use those to get out. But you think to yourself, you know what? I can ult this person. They seem to be by themselves. Their team isn't really paying that much attention. All of a sudden, you ult them. Enemy Genos throws a heal on them, or the enemy Ying, whatever the support, turns around, reacts really quickly, throws a heal on them. All of a sudden, your kill potentials are lost. You have the support and the damage dealer trying to focus you down. Now, all of a sudden, the tank is turning around. What do? You have to adapt. You have to figure, can I get out? Will these abilities allow me to get out? Or should I at least try to go for the 1-for-1 trade? Should I stall out and go deeper into their side of the map to make them turn around, recoup my cooldowns, and then come back and try it again? You have to figure out which decision, which course of action has the highest value to you and your team. What's going to help them capture the point or push the payload a little bit further? What's going to assist you in making the highest impact at that moment? And sometimes the answer might be to run away. Sometimes the answer might be to trade the 1-for-1, because maybe them losing their DPS means more than you losing, your team losing their flank, right? It's all going to be a case-by-case basis, and I think that's what's important about the dynamic thought that is provoked in esports, because no matter how niche or how specific your one game might be, there are so many intangibles and variables, from itemization to positioning to team compositions to different players playing the same champion differently to shot calling being different from... You have to parse so much information. And I think to be able to market that in a world, whether it be a continued esports career or non-esports career, is essential, right? Because not everyone's going to continue an esports career. Some people might want to go something a little more traditional. Maybe you have a passion for something else other than, but since you also had a passion for gaming, you decided, hey, I'll participate while I have the time. The events, your circumstances of your life will change all the time, but sometimes more rapidly than you even anticipate. So it's important to understand these types of skills that you can acquire. This way you can market them effectively in the future, right? So I have 2 more listed here. I'm going to save branding for last because I feel like that's a little more intricate. That's a more niche skill that requires a far more conscious thought from a player. But time management is definitely a big one, right? Especially the higher up the professional ladder that you do go, because if you're under an organization and you have a coach, then there's going to be a tendency to have this structure. They're going to provide you at the times that there's going to be VOD reviews for the team, one-on-one individual sessions with players so you can identify their goals, their progress, their needs. You're going to have situations where there's going to be blocks of scrimmages, right? Because you can't do VOD reviews without some level of VODs to actually review, right? So I think this time management is almost ingrained in a player because you do have to follow that. While different organizations might have different penalties or different ways of reprimanding players for missing out on things like this, I won't get into those specifics because I don't work in those organizations. Obviously, I wouldn't be able to quantify or qualify those types of opinions. It would only be speculation. I don't really want to go in that territory. But time management is pretty big. You're waking up on a pretty strict schedule. I know a lot of League players spend about like 10 to 16 hours a day playing League of Legends. I think it's more gearing towards the like 10, 12 hour mark these days because there are more, there's like coaches, assistant coaches, analysts, life coaches, chefs. So there are definitely like designated times in really high tier professional circuits where a player will have to wake up at a certain time, do whatever routine. They'll have designated physical fitness or some sort of equivalent. They'll have scrimmages for a certain amount of time, solo queue time. Some players are even demanded to stream for a certain amount of time throughout the week, and that's also to keep up with the brand and showing the brand off. And also they obviously have their own following at the highest level. And funny to mention branding because we could just hop right into that. I think time management in and of itself is kind of explanatory. It's very easy to see how players would be geared towards understanding how to manage their time. There aren't really a lot of complaints, at least that I've witnessed in the professional league circuit or below. Even my own personal experiences, I haven't really had many players that just go ghost or don't participate in certain events. Usually they'll tell me ahead of time, which is really good because that in and of itself is a professionalism right there. And while that's not necessarily a skill that I have on here, I think that's important, right? It's just that clarity, that forthcoming, that honesty, and that genuine. I guess that's a part of communication, right? Just being able to relay, hey, I actually can't make this. There are things that are happening in my personal life. Obviously, at the most professional tier, it's a little different because you're salaried, right? But I mean, in the amateur scene or semi-pro scene or maybe even the console scene for Paladins, you think there are other obligations. Sometimes players can't make a scrimmage. Obviously, they make the time to compete in the professional matches. But before I go further on that tangent, just wanted to make those caveats, right? So personal branding. I think this is really important, and it's kind of the big brain play. You'll actually notice if I do use Paladins as an example, that players like Cutie Shoe, players like Legacy, they know how to stoke the flames of not necessarily controversy, but they know how to incite responses in a way that's not necessarily harmful to them, and it doesn't make them look particularly like bad guys. You know what I mean? If they bother to do it. Shu, I think, is the wiser. He actually talks a lot less from what I've observed, at least on social media. And because of that, he has this kind of a more pristine personal brand, I feel like. Because even players that have been on teams with him have been a lot more outspoken, more trying to generate some controversy with their opinions or in interviews. And he's not really the type of guy. He's got this leverage moving forward should he participate in any esports career, let alone Paladins, where he could say, drama is not something that follows me. Keep my head down, just play the game, participate in everything the team needs, give my opinions here and there wherever I need to. And that's kind of the image that I get from the outside looking in. Now, I could be wrong. There are people who know him way better than I do, but that intimate knowledge is different from that outside perspective, that personal branding that you're giving off on social media, on stream, or however you choose to represent yourself and the organization that you're a part of, right? And I think that's really pivotal because when you do have a more pristine record, going forward, the connections that you do have, leveraged into positions that you might not have any ins with, gives you the higher chance, barring any other people applying for the same role who might also have ins in that area. But when you do have a resume like somebody who's won multiple lands, hard to contest with that, especially when their image looks so clean. On the other side of it, I guess you could use instances of like Sir James Parker, who had the suspension I'll call it just for derogatory behavior. I don't want to get into the specifics of that. I've already did a video on that. That's dead and gone as far as I'm concerned. This phase is already over. And it would be a little harder for him to make the same argument, right? Because you do kind of have that blemish on your professional esports record, and you have to go forward with that. Now, granted, obviously, being reprimanded for it, coming out the back end of it, onus on him to prove that he doesn't repeat that mistake, right? And I imagine it gets a lot easier as time goes on. Not everybody's going to have to deal with instances like that. In fact, I think the majority of players actually don't have to deal with it. But it's interesting to look at both perspectives and how it could affect personal branding, because that is, again, going to be the mark on him for a little while until it is dispelled through action, basically. Or I guess inaction of not repeating the consequence, right? The controversial decision. But for personal branding, I think of, just for quick examples, if you want some more, Loco Doco, who's from League of Legends. I'm not necessarily the biggest fan of his own content creation. He's got like a finicky personality, but he did well transitioning from player, spent time as a coach, and then transitioned into primarily content creator right now, as far as I understand. He's got like Listen Loco with Thorin. Less content creator, you can think... formerly from Team 8, there was a player named Dodo. I actually forget the position that he played while he was on Team 8. But he transitioned back when Team 8 was a thing. And we're talking like a few years ago. He transitioned now. He's actually, I believe, a coach to some capacity on Team Liquid, who is the #1 North American LCS team from the last split, finishing the playoffs #1, and then represented North America at MSI, where they actually finished second place, which is kind of unheard of, that two Western teams would take first and second at an international event where both Korea and China are. So, especially when the Chinese representative were the defending world champions coming from the Worlds tournament, right? So, you know, Dodo doing pretty good for himself, transitioning from player to the coaching capacity. What he did on the in-between, I'm not too educated on, so I won't speak on that. Other examples, again, from player to content creation, you could think Skara and I'm a Cutie Pie. They stream. I know Cutie Pie does more religiously, I think, than Skara, but they do shows together. Nice. But they do shows together. And you can find them on YouTube. A lot of people love their opinions. They could be silly, goofy, but they also have the bonus of being professional players, so they bring that knowledge with them when they do league analysis. They have guests come on, and they talk to them, right? So just interesting ways that the skills will translate and how people have used them. And that means that you too, as a player, or anybody who is an entry-level esports participant or participates in a less popular esport, can potentially look at this and say, oh, well, now that these skills are highlighted, it's good to think about. I'm going to actually actively ensure that I can hone these aspects of myself. This way I can bring them forward, whether I continue a career in esports as a player or even out of esports. So with that out of the way, I do want to elaborate on specifically, because I know a lot of people who have passion for esports do want to continue their career, but there is always a time, and it's going to vary from player to player, depending on what opportunities are available to you, what connections you might have, where your time competing professionally as a player might expire. You know, that's an inevitability. There are few people that I could count that still play League today that started a long time ago. And, you know, that's not bad. Esports careers in general are short, and longevity is hard to come by. So a few options that are available to players who have participated in any scene competitively. I'm just going to name a few, and then I'll elaborate on some examples who've successfully transitioned into these other roles, right? So there's broadcast or shoutcasting, right? And when I say that in general, because if you do have things like background in IT or other departments like production, you can go into the back end of broadcast, or likewise, since you have intimate knowledge of the game, you can do shoutcasting, because you know what's going on. You know what the ultimates and the abilities are called. You get to look at the game as it's being done live. You have the benefit of being on a team and being able to communicate concisely, and like we mentioned before, communicate even after the game to be able to diagnose very niche circumstances and how things interact. So you walk in with that benefit of being able to shoutcast a game and know more than most other people might, right? Plus, you'll have the added connections of whoever you met as a player and who you worked under, who might have been a coach or people that you've interacted with, maybe rival organizations that you scrimmed with regularly that you had a good relationship with, right? And I'll go more into those intangibles later on. But there's coaching and analyst work, which I think is a no-brainer. We already see people do that, like in Paladin's console scene. Ludex is a player. Obviously, he didn't transition to coaching full-time. He subs in if and when needed. But, you know, he fulfills mostly the coach and substitute role on the team. So I think that's an easy example. We can get into a few more as we go on. Then there's also like independent and topical podcasts. So when you think about that, you can think like Listen Loco, as I mentioned before, Loco Doco, he does that. Thorne's Thoughts, which ironically is also the thing I emulated in creating Leo's Logic, because I really like the way that Thorne covers topics. And for me, I wanted to do something similar. I wanted to break down things, present useful information, and potentially take unique takes on circumstances and happenings that are occurring in esports that I follow or participate in, because I feel like I often do have certain opinions that will either incite a really good debate or present a new light on a circumstance. So that's why I took this route, just a quick aside. Then there's also team management and auxiliary roles in organizations, right? You can think team manager. I don't think a lot of people who also do esports work in the culinary field, but you could be team chef, I guess. But, you know, there are a lot of positions within the team that could technically be fulfilled by other people. While I'm not too privy on the specifics of those roles, team management is the most prevalent that comes to mind, and we could start breaking down how people have treaded down the path from player, sometimes not even player, but transitioned into esports, leveraging their personal skills or their interests by encompassing their time around the esport and then going deeper into it, right? So the first example I'm going to give is a guy named Deficio. He's from League of Legends, most notably known for his time as a shoutcaster and analyst for the EULCS, now known as the LEC. And just a little backstory. So he played mid lane for teams like XL and Copenhagen Wolves from like 2012 to 2013. Copenhagen Wolves transitioned to Ninjas in Pajamas in 2013, and Deficio moved to a coach or managerial role. So early in 2014, he decided then that he would step down from that position in order to pursue shoutcasting full-time for the EULCS, then EULCS, where he swiftly became a core component of the broadcast. A lot of people really liked Deficio. Now, granted, a lot of people on the EULCS broadcast are actually very likable people, in my own opinion, but Deficio was actually quite the mainstay. And a lot of people were upset at the prospect that he could potentially not be on the desk, since he, in February of 2018, transitioned to a freelance shoutcaster, and then inevitably took a role later on in the year as a team manager for Origin, who got back into the LEC. I believe they brought back in. But he actually maintained his career as shoutcaster. The only difference was that he couldn't cast, I believe it was Origin's games for obvious conflict of interest. But, you know, this man went down the whole line. He was a player first. He had whatever connections that he had. Maybe he spoke to people at Riot. Speaks well. Obviously, that was proven over time as a shoutcaster. He knows exactly what he's doing when it comes to the game, breaks down everything, the specifics, even small interactions, usually sheds new lights on those or spotlights on smaller portions that maybe others might miss, and then transitioned even into management. I mean, he did coaching and management obviously in between before becoming the shoutcaster, but that was for a short span of time, and then he got back into it now. He's doing it for Origin, simultaneously making his appearance on the analyst desk, even shoutcasting, I believe sometimes. Might have to check up on that. If you want an example that's a little bit closer to home, you could actually think of Blue for my Paladins console friends, because as much as people might find it to be a divisive thing, Blue has taken a large majority of his own individual time in order to try to further the console scene. Granted, I think everybody can say there are some opinions that maybe you don't agree with, but you're not supposed to agree with everybody's opinions all of the time, right? People have their opinions because of their unique experiences and perspectives as they go into things, and you can challenge that, right? And you have two perspectives, they clash. You're usually supposed to find some level of truth within that, right? You share your knowledge, their knowledge, and you find a middle ground, even if you agree to disagree. But all that aside, initially he competed on Novus Gaming up until like mid-January 2018. That's where he stepped down in order to create Console Corner and consequent like podcast streams, etc. Right? Again, develop that weekly content via the stream, video, written regarding teams and players, whether it be on Twitter or outright articles sometimes. I'll call them articles, but you could say whatever you want to call them, just written pieces, really. Regularly track stats almost by himself, having people send them to him. Yes, I have to acknowledge the people who do take their time out to give him those. For the PCS and eventually the PCL, creating this comprehensive database that even some of the skill shot casters, when broadcasting these games, would go to him for this information. And they knew it was reliable information after a while because he was doing it for so long. And the players obviously fed that information with screenshots enabled, obviously. So, you know, that was provable information. And I think that shouldn't be an understated achievement, right? You're getting people who are on the official broadcast to look to you for statistics. And I think that's a pretty massive achievement, all in all. And then lastly, it culminated in the appearance on the November 2018 HRX desk as an analyst for the console matches, right? That's where Blue was. And that really speaks to me, because obviously he's still working his way, trying to build a career into getting maybe in with Hi-Rez Skillshot. But those are pretty big independent accomplishments, right? It is essentially a freelance analyst, coach, shoutcaster, since he's also taken the time recently to encourage people to play tens or play tournaments, whether it be like Overwatch or Paladins, just so he could cast them. Literally putting out tweets to do that. And I think that initiative should be respected, regardless what your thoughts might be about his opinions. But again, just to highlight someone who from the ground up has participated in this environment as a player first, then took the initiative to say, you know what, I don't want the glory of the player. I want to help this scene and I want to do more. So served in multiple different capacities. And that shouldn't be understated, right? Another example of an individual who transitioned through multiple phases of an esports career, and one of my favorite actually is going to be Duncan Thorin Shields, who is known as the esports historian, because largely his focus had been on lengthy, all-encompassing articles, videos, or interviews that focused on players' careers and other narratives associated with them. He's participated in esports journalism since 2001, primarily with Quake and Counter-Strike as the centerpieces of his earlier work. He hosts currently a number of podcasts. I actually don't know if this man sleeps, to be honest with you, because there's like Thorin's Thoughts, Listen Loco. We recently started one with LS. There was Summoning Insight, which I think is still continued with Monte Cristo. Which it was initially a League of Legends podcast until Monte Cristo switched over to casting Overwatch, in which it transitioned into Overwatch. But they cover a broad range of targets. Like he has some for CSGO, some for League, some for Overwatch, and many, many more, right? He's also received offers in the past from professional teams to serve in a coaching capacity, which he's declined, primarily because I think he felt he could do more autonomously this way. So that could be incorrect, but to my understanding, a vague memory from watching his own commentary in his own podcast, I think that was the case. There might have been other circumstances, but that's not important. It's neither here nor there. But this serves to emphasize how someone starts out in journalism, and they have the potential to go into other roles, but they actually decide to stay within that one course of action. And I think the reason why I wanted to really highlight this one is because you can continue as a player until your time expires, and then approach something a little more linearly. You can stay the shoutcaster. You can, on your off time, potentially write an article, this, that, and have these two conglomerates, right? You make your own content in multiple forms, multiple different forms of media, but then also work with dynamic personalities within the industry, right? Thorin's probably one of the only people who works with people across multiple esports, names that are well known, whether it be, like I said, CSGO or League of Legends or Overwatch, etc. So it's interesting to see how someone can build up that resume over time through primarily written work initially, and then more of video content as time went on, and develop this ability to be so well networked. And that's also to emphasize that public branding, right? Because Thorin, he's really good at just being who he is. And maybe he exacerbates certain certain personality traits of himself in order to play up that public persona. But he knows exactly who he is. He represents himself as exactly who he is. And people know what they're getting into the minute that they talk about him, because he's not erratic, he's consistent, and he's also very well versed, having spent so much time in the esports scene. And that span of time is also really important, because to harken back again, the experience you have as an esports athlete, so to speak, you're going to be able to leverage that in the capacity of journalism, in the capacity of content creation, in the capacity of shoutcasting. So all of these traits that we were highlighting before are going to be directly consequential to continuing an esports career or even seeking employment outside of it. The last example that I want to give, and I'm going to just shoot through this one because Monte Cristo is actually de facto my favorite of all content creators that I've ever had and analysts that I've ever had the pleasure of watching. He had humble beginnings. He was just an esports writer for WC Replays. It was a Warcraft 3 site, and he began casting for that same website, right? So casting Warcraft 3. He founded GG Chronicle, which was a website dedicated to journalism geared primarily towards the professional esports circuit. And then he began casting for OGN as part of the English broadcast for the LCK, the Korean League. This lasted up until about 2016, where Monte Cristo himself and Doa switched from League of Legends over to Overwatch. And they've been there ever since. They cast the Overwatch League. So if you watch Overwatch, you are quite familiar with who Monte Cristo is, more than likely already. He's also had the benefit of coaching a number of teams. Initially, when he was casting Warcraft 3, he did coach a team. I don't know for how long a duration of time. It was called Verge Gaming. He also coached CLG and League of Legends from about July 2013 to September 2014. This was done, I believe, primarily remotely because he lived in Korea at the time doing the casting. And lastly, he became the co-owner of Renegades from like June 2015 through May 2016. And that's a whole nother issue and can of worms to talk about. Something happened between him and Riot, primarily from Riot's side, mischaracterizing the situation and then punishing him for it. But we won't get into that. Now, the reason why I highlight this is because you have someone who hasn't been a player. Same thing with Thorin. They didn't play the game competitively, but they've participated in multiple esports titles and they have such extensive knowledge on it that they're able to do the shoutcasting. They've been able to coach, or at least been offered the position of coaching in the case of Thorin, right? And for people to understand that knowledge is present, that just participating in the scene is that imperative to understanding everything about the game, especially when you have that much dedication to watching the game, doing reviews of certain VODs, writing about niche topics when it comes to even the biggest stages of gameplay. That's not to be undervalued, right? That's a level of dedication and perseverance, which is not a skill that I highlighted, but also one that you learn when you are a competitor, because that passion drives you and you get to learn that discipline as well. More skills that you can leverage, by the way. But I want to highlight them too in particular, because unlike some of the other examples who were players first, I want to highlight these two to give hope to individuals who might not be the best at the game, but decide to invest enormous amounts of their own time studying the game. Because there is obviously paths that you can pursue to get into League of Legends, or into Paladins, or into Overwatch, or any other esport for that matter, just by virtue of doing the legwork. When you know so much about the game and you develop the content, you have this body of work where people can look at this portfolio and say, hey, you know what? This guy's really passionate about it. And judging on what he's writing, hey, you know what? Come here, player one on the team. Can you look at this content and tell me, what do you think about this guy's opinions? What do you think about his logic and how he decides to analytically put this piece together? Is there any merit here? And then you have a professional player all of a sudden giving their opinion potentially behind the scenes. Next thing you know, you just gained yourself an avenue. By the whole time you're doing content creation, you're running into other people who are also striving towards similar goals as you, and therefore now you have references. Now you have some sort of social network within the sphere that you're trying to penetrate, trying to stay in, trying to advance within, and all of a sudden you have a leg up. And it's interesting to note that, right? So just a few examples of people who were able to start a career in esports, whether it be as player or otherwise, and then advance so far down the line. I mean, just think about the scope of it, right? Thorin has been doing the journalism, esports journalism, since 2001. We're in 2019. That's 18 years. That's a long esports career. Now, again, players' careers are a lot shorter in comparison, but that's longevity right there. And that's why it's important to diversify, to manage these skills, to hone these skills, craft your own personal brand, make it something reliable, make it something that stands out, and most importantly, controversial, great, just not for the wrong reasons, you know what I mean? So let's discuss these intangibles really quickly before I cut this video off. The social network, as I just emphasized, that's going to be immensely powerful. Again, it's going to be references, people that you meet along the way. So obviously you want to be not a kiss ass, not a brown nose, but you obviously want to have interactions with people that are professional, respectable. Even if you disagree with people, it's fine to be not necessarily combative, but argumentative, right? Because argumentative just means that you're posing a question in response to something. You're debating something. You're not being disrespectful inherently. Debate and argument don't mean disrespect. They don't mean to be aggressive inherently. Those traits can come along with them, sure, but the two are not intertwined in such an intricate capacity that you can't separate the two. And I think that's important to diagnose as well for people moving forward. Now, granted, a lot of esports players are younger, so, you know, there's going to be some conflict, less experience in life. Everybody is different, so there are going to be some people who obviously deviate from this norm. But what I'm saying is, it wouldn't be uncommon for people to have moments where they do get heated, where they do get annoyed, where they do get a little combative. It happens, but don't define yourself by that. An infamous story, actually, if we want to get on that, would be Dardoch, who is a jungler in League of Legends. And I think he's an excellent example because he was regarded for a few splits to be probably the best North American jungler for League of Legends. But the problem was he also had this stigma where he was an exceptionally volatile player who would be enraged, who would give up, who would get toxic. And obviously that's bad for a team environment, because if the team's not on the same page, if the team can't manage to persevere, stick together, and stay above the tilt, above the mental boom, then that could drastically affect how they play and perform. So just as that little example, you don't want to be that guy, because for a long time he found himself bouncing along middle of the pack to lower the pack teams. And I still think to this day, I actually don't know what team he's on right now as of this split in League of Legends. Summer split just started about, I think this last Saturday actually, but yeah, you just don't want that stigma. It makes it exceptionally hard for you as an individual to bounce back from it, because unless you have an in, unless somebody has like an actual testimonial behind the scenes, this public driven narrative that spawns initially from something that does occur professionally, I imagine, but it becomes hyped and driven and kind of conflated and just dragged out of proportion. And so people see that and they see it all over the place and they feel like, well, there must be some merit to this. This is true. Obviously, people will do investigation to their own discretion to see whether or not something is valid. But you want to remove all the possibilities that something can negatively impact you in the first place. So you do want to have these professional interactions with everyone that you meet, even if they're not necessarily the kindest. You don't want to be out. You don't want to go out of your way to be rude, right? So yeah, that's just something to consider. But at the end of the day, I just wanted to cover those skills, things that I think players can generate, especially if they're consciously thinking and perceiving it, and even subconsciously when you're just participating in the environment. It really does expand what you're capable of as an individual. And maybe it's not something that all players are aware of, in which case that's why I highlighted it here. This way, when you do go forward into the real world or continue your esports career, whatever path you want to take, you get to now market yourself knowing exactly what you're equipped with, knowing exactly how to demonstrate with your own experiences how you've developed every single skill that I've highlighted, and then some, right? Because we mentioned like discipline more towards the tail end of things. And I think that's imperative. So I just want to do a quick shout out to Garcia, who brought this topic to my attention in the first place. So I found it worth exploring. Decided to pull more so on my own experience to see what I've witnessed and kind of logically deduce exactly how certain skills would be honed or would be crafted or refined based on the esports environments that I've been a part of. So shouts to Garcia, and thanks to everybody who's watched. Another video coming at some point.